This video is for parents of kids who often find themselves avoiding large crowds, haircuts, birthday parties, jeans, button down shirts, and certain foods because they can be so overwhelming. Well, sensory processing disorder symptoms can be hard on kids and on parents. And so this video is for moms and dads who want to dive deeper into sensory processing disorder and other sensory struggles that they've noticed pop up in their kiddos and who have tried things like therapies and diets with minimal progress. So, what's going on? Well, there's two different types of sensory processing challenges. So there's avoidant sensory processing and there's sensory seeking. So sensory avoidant is commonly seen in individuals with on the autism spectrum who walk into, it's the large crowds, they're too overwhelming, loud noises are overwhelming, where they want to avoid, they maybe don't want to be touched, the sensory touch is too overwhelming, too much. And then there's also sensory seeking. And so this is when they're always in need of stimulation, it's like chewing on their clothes or in need of the stimulation. And so sometimes children actually have a mix of both. And so what's really the root cause and what's going on here? Well, we always look at kiddos and we say, how much stress do we expect to see in their body? And how much stress have they been exposed to? So, when we talk about stress in kiddos, where does stress come from in kids? I mean, how stressed out can they really be? Well, it's interesting. We call it the perfect storm, and the perfect storm is made up of the physical stress, the mental and emotional stress, and the chemical or environmental stress. And so, how much of these, how early, how often, and how much of these have they been exposed to so far is indicators of how much tension we expect to see and how much imbalance we expect to see in their nervous system. And imbalance is important because we look at the nervous system and we want balance. You can't be in growth and survival at the same time. And so finding balance is key for progress to be made, especially when we talk about how chiropractic can support other therapies. If we're regulating the nervous system and putting that in balance, growth and development is much more accessible than the body focusing just on survival. So, what's the perfect storm? What are these? The perfect storm is first mental and emotional stress. Where does mental and emotional stress come from for kids? Well, primarily, depending on the age, primarily it's maternal stress babies in utero. How high risk was the pregnancy, how much stress was there, etc. And then also, depending on how shifted out of balance their nervous system is, it can also be a lot of just everything that they have going on, or these sensory things where it's so much, their body is already so exhausted or has so much noise already, which we'll talk about, that they lack the bandwidth. So a lot of the little things that may seem not quite as big really start to accumulate. We talk about there's a stress bucket and how much we put into the bucket. We also want to drain the bucket, which is how well we're regulating to stress, how much support we're giving our bodies during stress, etc. So how well are we regulating that and how much is accumulating? When stress accumulates in the bucket and we're not draining it and it starts to overflow, that's symptoms. And so we'll chat a little bit later, but we don't want to be symptoms based. We don't want to chase symptoms and we don't want symptoms to be an indicator of what's really going on, because symptoms really are the tip of the iceberg, that classic iceberg diagram where you see the iceberg and above the surface it's this much and below the surface it's huge. And that really is so true about symptoms. And so that's why it's so important to get to the root cause and to dive deeper, and to also have indicators that you can measure that go beyond just symptoms. So mental and emotional stress, Physical stress is oftentimes seen in the birthing process. I mean, that's the most traumatic and stressful event thus far in baby's life. And some births may or can be more stressful than others, especially if there are birth interventions, especially if there's a C-section. Different things like that can contribute. How intense the birthing process was, even how quick it was, is a form of intensity. If there's an induction and pitocin, that can increase the intensity of the contractions. And so not necessarily saying that these are bad things, because ultimately the goal is to have a happy, healthy baby, and sometimes birth interventions are necessary for that overall outcome. But if you can imagine, it's very physically traumatic or stressful on baby's body, especially in a body that has little muscle tone. The first thing they tell you to do is hold baby's head when baby's born, but yet we're pulling them out by their head and their neck and acting like we can use as much force as possible. And not to say that that's bad. I mean, obviously, the birthing process is what it is, and we want to achieve a certain outcome. But to say that that's not impacting baby's body physically from a tension standpoint would be inaccurate. So that's physical stress, we have mental and emotional stress, and the last thing we have is environmental or toxic stress. And this can be anything that our body is exposed to that our body has to filter out. So, especially if we're seeing a lot of reflux or ear infections, there could be chronic exposure to antibiotics. There could be different things in baby's environment, different medications, etc. And those things accumulate. And so it's one of the things where antibiotics are great to have when you need antibiotics. But oftentimes, especially when we see chronic ear infections, the gut takes a big hit from antibiotics. And to be on them, potentially multiple times a year is really saying it takes up to a few years for the gut to really actually repair and restore from antibiotics. And so by coming in multiple times with antibiotics, how is that impacting the body physically? Especially the gut. The gut is a whole nother topic, but the gut is so integral into every system and every function in the body, into our immune system, into our mental health, into so many different things. And so much is housed in our gut, but yet we eat foods and we take medications and we treat our gut like it's just an afterthought, when in reality, the health of our gut is directly related to overall health in general. So it's very important for us to focus on. Now, the next thing is physical stress, mental, emotional stress, chemical stress. So that's the perfect storm. That's how we expect to see more stress accumulating in a child's body. And so when we talk about, we're seeing. Okay, so how can we help? So where are we going with this? So we have these three forms of stress. We're seeing these symptoms. Like I said, it's the top of the iceberg. And so how do we help? Well, in our office, we look at 3 scans. We look at these scans to see how well the nervous system is functioning. We have a thermal scan, which also measures inflammation and looking at overall different areas of more inflammation, or different areas that there's more going on. And then the second thing we look at SAMG, which is muscle activity. How much energy is your body using to maintain baseline? And especially when we're talking about sensory processing kiddos, we tend to see the total energy their body is using to maintain baseline is very high. And so it's the fact that at rest, they're already so stimulated. At rest, there's already so much that their body is producing, or their total energy is already so high. And then that leads us to our third scan, which is an HRV, which measures the adaptability or the bandwidth the body has to stress. And oftentimes when we have this total energy is so high, or this resting tension is so high, on just a regular basis, the HRV tends to show signs of accumulated fatigue or even potentially burnout. And so that shows us how long has this really been going on, and that their body has been trying to adapt, but over time, it's just accumulating fatigue and exhaustion. And so when we look at that, we're saying, like, how much slack is there in the rope? Like, how adaptable is their body when it is in the face of a stressor? And this is important because in sensory processing, the stressor can be something as simple as loud noise, or as simple as bright lights, or different things like that, where it's not necessarily you know, stress in terms that you would think of in an adult, but when they're exposed to these things, which we're so exposed to, especially in a modern society, they're all over the place. We're constantly inundated with more noise, more light, more notifications, more stress, go faster, have a busy schedule, etc. There's a lot going on. And so what we're saying is the bandwidth or the slack in the rope is already so small. So when we have these smaller stressors, the body is going to respond either by seeking sensory as a form of calming or avoiding sensory because it says too much, too much. And so it's too much, it's an overload on the nervous system. And so that's one of the things that we look at when we look at these scans is we say, is their body already using so much total energy at rest? And then are we also seeing that this has been happening for a while, therefore accumulating burnout and fatigue from this? And how can we give them support? And so by giving them support and helping regulate that nervous system, we increase the bandwidth or we increase the slack in the rope so that when they're exposed to stressors, their body is more adaptable and not quite as reactive when exposed to stressors. So that's essentially what we would look for. It's how we would test beneath the signs and symptoms by looking at these scans. And we can see, we can use them to quantify, and we can also use them as indicators and layering that on top of what we're finding on the table and on top of what we're finding in signs and symptoms so that we can really get to the root cause. And that way, we not only give their body more bandwidth, regulating their nervous system so that they're more adaptable when they're exposed to these stressors, but we're putting their body back in the growth and development versus stress so that when they go into other therapies, even whether that be occupational therapy or PT or speech therapy, etc., play therapy, so many different types of therapy, when they're going into these, their bodies have more room, or they're more adaptable to learn and to grow and develop versus focusing just on survival. So make a consult at our office to go ahead and get your kid scanned so we can look at these scans and we can talk numbers and we can see what's going on under the surface with your child and how we can help. I'd love to hear about your child's experience and sit down and talk to you about how we can help your child.